A ship's bell tolls in the fog. What happens when order shatters and men are left alone with the sea and their own darkest thoughts? This is the story of the HMS Bounty mutineers, a crew whose desperate bid for freedom twisted into a terrifying psychological unraveling. By the end, you will understand the true cost of isolation and the shocking fragility of the human mind. We will uncover how a tropical paradise became a prison of paranoia and why only a handful of people survived the collective descent into madness. What does it truly take for a person to lose their grip on reality? The tension aboard the HMS Bounty was a physical presence, thick as the tropical humidity. For weeks, Captain William Bligg's command had been a relentless barrage of public humiliations and disproportionate punishments. His voice, sharp with contempt, carved away at the men's dignity over matters as trivial as a missing cheese or a poorly coiled rope. The ship itself was a floating world of enforced order, every plank and rope belonging to the king, yet the spirit of its crew was quietly fracturing. They had just completed a long and difficult mission, collecting breadfruit plants from Tahiti, a paradise where the men had experienced a life of ease and respect. Returning to the rigid hierarchy and Bligg's tyranny felt like a sentence. The key figures in the coming storm were not monsters. Fletcher Christian, the acting lieutenant, was a gentleman by birth but trapped by debt, a man who had once considered Bligg a friend. He had borne the brunt of the captain's rage more than any other, his spirit visibly broken by constant, unjust reprimands. Then there was John Adams, a seaman seeking a fresh start, and a core group of others who simply saw no future under Bligg's whipped tongue. Their grievances were not about grand treason but about survival. They were exhausted, demoralized, and desperately afraid of the long voyage home under a commander who seemed to delight in their misery. The mutiny itself was not a long-planned conspiracy. It was a spark in a powder keg. On the morning of April 28, 1789, Bligg's accusations over some stolen coconuts became the final, unbearable provocation. Something inside Fletcher Christian snapped. The man was seen in a state of utter agitation, muttering that he was in hell. In that moment, the decision was made. It was a desperate, reckless bid for freedom, not for a life of piracy, but for a return to the peace they had known. With the help of a few armed companions, Christian seized control of the ship, surprising even Bligg with the suddenness of the act. The captain and 18 loyal men were forced into a small, open launch and cut adrift on the vast, open ocean, a death sentence everyone expected them to fulfill. This was the rupture, the point of no return. In casting out their captain, the mutineers had not only broken the law, they had shattered the only social order they had ever known. They were free, but they were now utterly alone, adrift in every sense, setting the stage for a far more terrifying journey into the depths of their own minds. The open sea offered no escape from the consequences of their actions. As the Bounty pulled away from the small launch carrying Captain Bligg and his loyalists, a chilling silence fell over the mutineers. They had won their freedom, but what did that freedom actually mean? Fletcher Christian stood at the helm, a man haunted, staring at the shrinking speck on the horizon that held his former captain and any chance of a normal life. He had no grand plan. The initial adrenaline-fueled act was over, and the grim reality of being fugitives from the entire British Royal Navy began to set in. Their first decision was one of pure survival. They turned the ship around, sailing back toward the island of Tahiti. It was the only place they knew that offered food and shelter, a temporary refuge where they could perhaps hide and gather their wits. But this single choice immediately revealed the fractures within their group. Not every man who had taken part in the mutiny had done so with the same conviction. Some, like the young midshipman George Stewart, had been swept up in the moment, their loyalties torn. Now, faced with the irreversible nature of their crime, a deep unease took root. The shared purpose that had bound them together for a few violent hours was already dissolving into a murky pool of individual fears. What had felt like a necessary rebellion on the cramped deck of the Bounty now felt, under the vast and empty sky, like a catastrophic mistake. The men began to argue, where should they go after Tahiti? How could they possibly avoid the British warships that would surely be sent to hunt them down? Christian wanted to find a remote, uncharted island, a place they could disappear forever. Others were terrified by this idea, preferring to take their chances in Tahiti, despite the near certainty of eventual capture. This was the first major crack in their unity. The mutineers were no longer a crew with a single goal. They were a collection of frightened individuals, each suddenly realizing the immense weight of their isolation, and each beginning to wonder if they had trusted the right people. The paradise they were sailing toward would soon become a gilded cage, and their temporary sanctuary would force the final, fateful split among them. Tahiti offered no lasting peace, only a stark and terrifying choice. The island's warm embrace was a trap, its shores certain to be the first place the Royal Navy would look. Fletcher Christian knew this, and his paranoia began to poison the air. He started seeing conspiracies in every whispered conversation and potential traitors in every man who hesitated. The group, already fractured, now faced an ultimatum. Christian demanded they abandon this temporary haven and sail into the absolute unknown, seeking an island so remote it did not appear on any chart. Those who refused would be left behind, marooned with the near certainty of capture and the gallows. 16 men chose to stay, gambling on the mercy of the British Empire. But 9 others, along with a group of Tahitian men and women they had essentially kidnapped, were forced to follow Christian. This was the birth of a new tyranny, far more absolute than the one they had escaped. They were no longer a crew of mutineers. They were the desperate followers of a man whose mind was closing in on itself, a man who trusted no one and ruled by fear. Once at sea, the vast, empty horizon became a mirror for their collective anxiety. Christian's leadership curdled into a harsh, unpredictable despotism. He kept the ship's course a secret, navigating by instinct and a desperate hope, sharing his plans with no one. This single act bred a deep, pervasive fear among the men. Where were they going? Did he even know? Every shift of the wind, every change in the clouds was scrutinized for omens. The most basic elements of survival became sources of suspicion. A missing piece of cloth, a cask of water that seemed to empty too quickly, a man receiving a slightly larger portion of food. These minor incidents were no longer trivial. They were seen as evidence of betrayal, of secret hoarding, of a plot to seize control of their doomed voyage. The man who had once been a victim of tyranny was now its architect, enforcing a brutal order born from his own unraveling sanity. Trust, the essential glue that holds any isolated group together, evaporated completely. It was replaced by a constant, gnawing vigilance. Each man watched the others, not as shipmates, but as potential enemies, all of them trapped in a floating prison of their own making, sailing toward a destination that felt more like a myth than a refuge. Their refuge appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a jagged green jewel rising from an endless blue desert. Pitcairn Island was everything Fletcher Christian had hoped for, remote, lush, and blessedly absent from the Royal Navy's charts. The initial landing must have felt like a divine deliverance. They burned the Bounty in the bay, a final, dramatic severance from their old world, a sacrifice meant to ensure they could never leave. For a brief, hopeful moment, they were not fugitives, they were founders, the sole inhabitants of a pristine Eden. They built crude huts, planted gardens from the seeds they had saved, and divided the land. But the very isolation that protected them from the outside world began to compress their tiny society, magnifying every grievance and fear. The island was not a blank slate, it was a pressure cooker. The social structure they had imported was fatally flawed. The 9 British mutineers ruled over a group of Polynesian men and women, some of whom had come willingly, others who had been taken by force. This was not a community of equals. The British men, including Christian, claimed the Polynesian women as wives, treating the Polynesian men as servants or, worse, as rivals. The initial cooperation quickly curdled into a system of brutal exploitation. The Polynesian men, stripped of their status and their freedom, watched as the foreigners took their women and controlled the island's resources. Resentment simmered, a slow poison in their tropical paradise. The struggle was no longer just about survival, it was about power, possession, and a deep cultural humiliation. The first death was a thunderclap that shattered the fragile peace. One of the Polynesian men was killed during a dispute over a woman. This single act of violence tore away the thin veneer of civilization. It signaled that conflict would now be settled not with words but with muskets and clubs. Retaliation was inevitable. A conspiracy formed among the Polynesian men, a plan to seize back their lives by killing the white men. They knew they were outgunned, so they resorted to stealth and treachery. The killings that followed were methodical and brutal. Fletcher Christian was ambushed and murdered while working in his field, cut down by an axe, the man who had led them to this promised land becoming its first bloody sacrifice. He was not the only one. In a swift and terrifying series of attacks, 5 of the mutineers were slaughtered. The sanctuary was now a killing ground, the lush forests hiding ambushes and the streams running red. A terrifying new order, or rather disorder, took hold. The few surviving white men, led by the hardened Edward Young and the increasingly pragmatic John Adams, allied with the remaining Polynesian women to turn the tables. They hunted down and killed almost all of the Polynesian men in a cycle of revenge that left the small community drenched in blood. In a matter of months, the population was nearly halved. The society had completely collapsed, devolving into a primal state where the only law was vengeance and the only right was that of the strongest. The beautiful island, with its plentiful food and water, had become a prison of paranoia, where every shadow could hide an enemy and trust was a luxury that got you killed. The mutineers had escaped the tyranny of a captain only to create a far more visceral and immediate tyranny of their own making. A stark demonstration of how quickly humanity can erode when all external structures are removed. The bloodshed finally ceased, leaving only 4 men alive amid the graves they had dug for their companions. The silence that settled over Pitcairn Island was heavier than any storm. In a single, brutal year, the dream of a new society had cannibalized itself, leaving a handful of traumatized survivors surrounded by the ghosts of their own choices. This was the tragic, complete arc of the mutineers, a journey that began with an act of defiance against tyranny and ended in a self-created hell. They had traded the harsh discipline of a captain for the absolute lawlessness of isolation, and in doing so, they discovered that the human mind is the most fragile cargo of all. When every external structure of civilization is stripped away, the internal frameworks of morality and cooperation can crumble with terrifying speed. The very freedom they fought for became a different kind of captivity, one built from paranoia, cultural conflict, and the unchecked darkness of the human heart. The story of the Bounty Mutineers is not just a tale of rebellion. It is a stark lesson in the psychological toll of extreme isolation, revealing how quickly a community can devolve when trust evaporates and the only goal left is mere survival. Out of this carnage, an unexpected legacy was forged. The sole surviving mutineer, John Adams, experienced a profound transformation. Haunted by the violence, he found solace in a Bible salvaged from the burned ship, and he slowly built a new, peaceful community with the Tahitian women and the children born on the island. When an American sealing ship finally stumbled upon Pitcairn in 1808, they did not find a den of murderous pirates. They found a devout, orderly settlement led by a patriarch who preached forgiveness. The island itself remains a silent monument to this descent into madness and the fragile redemption that followed, a living testament to the best and worst of human nature. What do you think is the ultimate lesson from this harrowing story? Is it about the dangers of absolute freedom or the essential need for community and law? Share your thoughts in the comments below.